Hello everybody and welcome to the Quilters Apothecary. Today we are doing a tutorial on how to do a simple edge-to-edge on your quilt with the wonderful Handi Quilter Pro Stitcher, and we are going to be using the Pro Stitcher on the Forte, which is our 24-inch throat machine. Now there are a lot of different ways to do edge-to-edge computerized on the Pro Stitcher, and I want to take you through the very initial one that I learned. As a new quilter, what I found was I was intimidated by computers. Um, Computer quilting did not come easy for me. I'd actually had about 4 or 5 different systems before this. And with the Pro Stitcher, I found that it was just really easy. And this first method that I'm going to show you right now is the first method that I learned and kind of taught myself. So we're going to go here for our new Pro Stitcher users. So let's go over to the computer, we'll go over to the quilt, we're going to show how it's all set up. We've already loaded our quilt. We did that on an earlier tutorial, and we also already talked about basting the edges in the top. So everything is ready for us to get started. So let's head over. Now we're over here at the machine, we're ready to start our quilt, but before I want to set up my space for my quilt, the very first thing I'm going to do is to go up and pull up my Handi Quilter screen. The reason I want to do that is I want to check to make sure that I have my stitches per inch in the proper place, and I like to do my edge to edges at 12 stitches per inch. The other thing that I like is I like to run in regulator, not manual, so I'm going to go over to regulator, and I'm also going to make sure that I am on precision rather than cruise. And now I know that everything's set up, I can go ahead, get rid of that screen, get that out of the way, and now I am ready to go ahead and set up my area. For a simple edge-to-edge method, normally one would assume to start here at the top to set your area. But what I like to do is I like to come down to the bottom. And the reason I like to come down to the bottom of my throat space is just in case here, when I've loaded the quilt, if it's an unevenly pieced quilt and there's any overhang on the roller, in other words, an hourglass type shaped quilt, then what will happen is whatever I'm reading up at the top will not be adequate when I get down here. It actually may extend out a little further. I also want to make sure that I don't set my area for the very edge. I am going to leave a little bit of overlap, and I like to leave an inch. And again, an inch not from the top up here, but actually an inch compared to the very edge or the furthest edge that this is going to come out on the actual quilt top roller. So now I'm going to line that up. I'm going to slide up, I'm going to go right up to the top, and now what I'm going to do is, of course, I'm going to keep that space so that I know that all the way down as I quilt my quilt, I'm never going to have an area where I'm not quilting within the parameters of the quilt. I'm going to go an inch higher on this particular quilt because we're using a square design. Actually, I might come down to about 1/2 of an inch because it is such a nice square design that we're using on this. And what I'm going to do is set my area. Now for my area, what I'm actually going to do is go to File. I'm going to go to Area. And now I'm going to use 2-corner area. Now there's 2 ways to do that. I can go ahead and hit the 2-corner, or I could use the star on my left-handed handle, as long as I haven't changed that to something else, because these can be reprogrammed. So if I hit star, that's set the upper left of my quilt, and then I'm going to slide over to the other side and I'm going to set the bottom for my 2-corner area. We've set our upper left parameter for our 2-corner area. I'm going to come down with the machine. I am going to repeat that same process by coming to the bottom of my throat space. I'm going to slide down. I'm going to make sure that the edge of my quilt on the leader, not on the actual batting, but on the leader, is in place, and I'm going to over or outer lap by about 1/2 of an inch or an inch based on the design itself. And with this design, again, it's pretty square, so I can be safe with 1/2 of an inch or an inch. And now that I have that lapped over, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to hit my star button again, and that is going to give me my space. Now, what that has is 14.75 deep up on my screen, as you see, by I think 77.99. Now, obviously, my quilt is longer than that, so I'm simply going to go in to the height, and my quilt is actually 101 because I pre-measured it long, and I'm going to add a few extra inches to take in any roller or stretching that can happen, and I'm going to enter 103. And I find 2 to 3 inches is a nice safety zone. And of course, you want to make sure that you would have enough backing and batting to take that into account as you do this. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. So now my quilt is 77.99 by 103. So now I am ready to enter my design. One of the things that I like to do once you set your 2-point area is I want to see my whole quilt area. So what I do is I go down to my home and I hit my home button, and that gives me the complete quilt that the quilt design is going to fill. And I just like to see that whole thing as I'm deciding on my design and I'm setting up my design. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to File, hit my File. I'm going to go to Design. Now we already have Flowers with Leaves by Deb Geisler. That's the design that we are using in this particular quilt. Is up, but I want to take you into the file so you can see how to find it in the file. So I'm going to go to Open my file. Now I already go into Deb Geisler, which is already open, and I find my Flowers with Leaves. So I'm going to hit Flowers with Leaves, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit Open. And that's going to bring my Flowers with Leaves pattern right into the quilt. Now that design is a little too tight and small for the quilt that I'm actually going to be putting it on. It's 11.86 by 12.02, so I want to make it a little bit bigger. So I am going to modify the design. So now what I'm going to do is to go up to Modify. I'm going to hit Modify, and I want to make sure to constrain the design and keep it in its proper proportions. Okay, so notice that lock is already there. That's not normal for a new design. We actually had it up earlier, so it's already locked. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the lock button again. When it's not highlighted, it is not constrained. So I want to reconstrain and keep it in proportion. So I'm going to go ahead and hit lock, and you can see that cross that goes across it, and that keeps it in perfect proportion as you widen it and narrow it and do your repeats. Now, I am going to take this design up to 15.2. I like that size for this quilt. And that's going to be a nice size to fill the area and not overtake the quilt. The next thing that I'm going to do will be I'm going to do my repeats. So now that I have the size that I want, I'm going to go over, I'm going to go to repeat, and I'm going to show you two different options. One of the options would simply be to fill the quilt. So I could go to the fill button and hit fill, and that would fill the quilt. And then I would go ahead, and we have the horizontal highlighted, so I would hit stretch, and then we would hit the vertical, and I would hit stretch again, and that would stretch it out. Now what we would do next would be to go ahead and add our point to point, which would lock the rows, and then also we would close our space between the rows. But before we do that, I'm going to take you back a few steps and show you the way that I like to do it. So I'm going to undo, take it back. We're still on our perfect size, and now I'm going to go over to horizontal. I hit the horizontal, and I'm going to add how many repeats I want to do. See, it's nice to be able to do this manually. You have a little bit more control. So now I just added 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 repeats for my horizontal repeat. And notice that off the left it's hanging off a little bit. We're going to fix that in a minute. It's automatically going to self-correct. And then I'm going to go to my vertical. And then I'm going to add my vertical repeats. 1, 2, 3, do, do, do. Now I like that. So that's a nice repeat amount for me vertically as well as horizontally. So now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to horizontal. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit stretch. Okay, so now I have stretched out to fill the space horizontally, and now I'm going to go back to vertical, and now I'm going to hit stretch. And what that did was that tightened the space there. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. And what I want to see is how close are my rows to each other. So I see there that it's a pretty good distance between. It's a nice spacing. It's not too much, it's not too little. But what I want you to see is that the gap, if I wanted to close the gap, I would hit minus, and what that would do is close that gap between the rows, or I could hit plus if I wanted to widen that gap. And you can see how that gap is widening. And now I'm going to do minus again, and I'm going to close it. And I actually like that tightness right there. Now I want to go back to horizontal, because the next thing that I want to do, I love the look of my quilt, and now to finalize this, I'm going to go ahead and go to point to close my horizontal row. I'm going to hit point to point, and now each of these rows are perfectly locked in and they are complete. The next thing, which would be the last thing I'm going to do before I actually save this design, is I'm going to go over and I'm going to baseline the design. And that's going to take this complete area and turn it into one complete design rather than multiple designs based on the repeats vertically and horizontally. So now everything is locked in. Now I am ready to quilt except for one thing, and it is one of the most important things for whether you're new or seasoned computerized quilters to remember. You need to save this just in case something happens and you need to have this perfect space to bring back and fix, or if let's say the power goes out in the middle, let's say, so this design is not lost, you want to make sure save the design. It's one of the most important things. So I'm going to go to File, I'm going to hit Save, and then I'm going to go to Workspace. So we've got Workspace, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save my workspace. And do I want to write over existing file? Yes, because that came up before, because we had actually done this before, and I refilmed it to be just a little bit more clearer for everybody. So now we have saved that design, and now I am ready to quilt the quilt. So now, because this video is about giving you as much information as possible, what I want to give you is your Pro Stitcher sew head options. So what I'm going to do is, we were in Modify, our design is set, we've saved our design. I'm going to go right now into Pro Stitcher, and then I'm going to go into Quilt. Now we already have that highlighted. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go into Workspace, and then I'm going to go back into Quilt so that you see where that's at. Now you're going to look here on the right side, and the stitch is whether or not it's going to stitch or simply the machine is going to move to audition the design. I want to have stitch highlighted in green. And then the next thing we're going to do is our start tie off. I like to have my start tie off on, and of course you would have set that for how many tie offs you like. I think I like about 4 or 5. And then of course I want my end tie off. I also want my pull up on. I don't want to have to do that manually. So I'm going to go pull up on. Now, then again, my pull up auto, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to put that on. Now, I like to have all 5 of those highlighted. The next thing that I like to do is I like when I first start quilting and it takes the first few stitches, I like my machine to go just a little ways and then come to a stop so that I can trim my tail. So to do that, I'm going to go up here into the gears and I'm going to hit gears, and you'll see up here it's pause delay. I'm going to turn that off and then I'm going to turn that back on. That way you know right where that button's at least where it's at on my head. Now, in your right hand side here, there are 2 options for this. You could do it for seconds, for time. In other words, it'll sew a little bit, it'll stop for maybe 3 seconds is what we would have it at now, and then you've got a snip, and then it's just going to start in 3 seconds. What I prefer is inches. So when I have the seconds, it would be right there, and when I have inches, it would be right there. And I want to make sure that my on is highlighted as well. So now what's going to happen is it's going to travel when it starts quilting and everything's locked. It's going to go 3 inches stop. I'm going to trim my tail, and then I'm going to manually hit the restart button, which we're going to see shortly. So now those things are all in place. Now I'm going to go back to File. I am going to go back to Pro Stitcher. And now I am ready to quilt. Okay, we are ready to roll. We have our bobbin in and it's ready to go. I have a nice full bobbin. I have my top thread loaded. Everything's good there. I have checked my thread path to make sure everything's good. I have also checked to make sure that my orange gears are on. We are in Pro Stitcher and we are ready to run. And the other thing that I would add is I have my wonderful Glide 2 foot on. It is the only foot I will have on my machine when I'm doing any computerized work. So now the next thing I'm going to do is we're going to hit run, and then what will happen is I have another screen that comes up that says make sure needle is up. You never have your system in needle down when you're doing any type of computerized quilting work. That is a major disaster waiting to happen. And I love this safety. It always asks you to double check. So now needle is up. I hit proceed. It's going to go up to the top. Keep a hold of my top thread, take a stitch, pull away. I'm going to grab my bobbin thread. I'm going to hold both, just like if I were doing freehand, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit resume. It's going to take my locking stitches. It's going to start and take a few stitches. Now that's going to be that pause. So now that's that 3 inches pause. I'm going to reach around. I'm going to trim my tail so that that's not in the way. And then I simply hit resume. Now I keep a nice eye on this as it's working across. It's not like I'm going to go and make dinner or work on a different project, at least not when you're new. You may choose to do something like that later on when you're seasoned. I don't, but I'm going to keep an eye on it. If I notice any fullness in any areas, I would be able to manipulate the fabric. And we can see we've got that safety zone that's going to go right down the side. So this quilt is going to be perfectly stable as it's getting quilted. It's going to work its way across. I've got 12 nice stitches per inch. And by the way, when you notice that this goes off the edge, the one thing that I want to add, which we're going to see when this quilt is completed, is once this quilt is done, I am going to re-roll it on the way back up and re-quilt and base the edge of my quilt. That way my stitches are all locked so that when I trim it for my client, she's going to have a nice, easy bind on it and none of the stitches are going to come loose. That's the way I like to do it. And again, this is my easy edge-to-edge method. And in our next video, we're actually going to do a nice crop. So we're cropping out all of our edges. But we're going to start easy and we're going to work our way up. The other thing that I will add is I do have my Pro Stitcher set on manual speed of 52%. I do not have the OptiStitch on. Okay, so now we go ahead and we pull away, give ourselves a little slack, we come back, half stitch down, half stitch up, pull away, we have our thread now. We're going to snip right at the quilt, and now our first row is done, and I'm going to show you how to do our drag and drop to line up and roll for our second row. Okay, so now we're going to roll our quilt and prep for our next section. I'm going to bring this over. I am going to locate a space right in the center of the quilt, down towards the bottom of the quilting, and I like to go right to a point. I'm going to bring that right to a point. I'm going to drop a single stitch so my needle is down. And then the next thing I'm going to do is, of course, go right to my screen and I'm going to hit drag. So now I hit drag and our green has drag engaged, and then the next thing it says on there is drop. So now our needle is down, I'm going to roll the quilt, and because I have our drag engaged, now as I roll the quilt it's going to hold the space of the design so that I don't have to reline everything up for the next row. Now that I have drag engage, now I can come and take care of my side clamps, but we never want to do our side clamps before we engage our drag and drop. Take that out, and then I'm going to go over to the other side, repeat that, and then we're going to roll the quilt. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to raise my batting access bar so that I can smooth everything out underneath and make sure that there aren't any dark threads or batting distortion. We want to make sure to lock our dogs, both sides. Of course, make sure your backing is nice. I always then like to come over here and I want to test my tension. Again, I'm going to take my finger, I'm going to stick it right up through the quilt sandwich, and I only want to be able to grab to about halfway between my tip of my finger and my first knuckle. So half to 3/4 of the way. Not bad. That's really nice. And this is a flannel back, so it's going to stretch just a little bit more. So that's nice. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go over here and we're going to do our drop because we have located our position. Side note, before we actually do that, we want to make sure to re-engage our side clamps before we go ahead and do our drop. We always want as little distortion as possible once we get everything into place and hit that drop. Okay, now we have our side clamp on. The quilt is at the proper tension, so the next thing I like to do is just kind of jiggle this a little bit so it finds its perfect home. That way, if it's hung up on anything or off just a quarter or a half of an inch, it's going to automatically spring to its home. And then I go up here and I disengage the drop. Now, before I actually start my second row, I'm going to do a final check. I just want to go over here, line up a few of my key points, make sure that everything lines up, that hits the tip of that leaf exactly, just like you see on the computer screen. Let me go over here. Let me check this one. Now, I could go all the way across and double check. I've done this enough so that I know that it's set up, but for your first few times, you may want to go along the quilt and just check to see if it's nice and close or tight or exact. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, of course, is we're going to restart. But one of the things that I do that's a little different than a lot of people is I always want to make sure with a dense quilt to go ahead and start with a new bobbin. I'm checking my bobbin. Sometimes on some of the less dense designs I can get 2 rows per bobbin. But on this particular design right here, what we have is we are almost out of bobbin. So I'm just going to go ahead and reload a bobbin, and I'm going to start fresh every row with a brand new bobbin. That's one less thing I have to worry about. Okay, so now, very simply with the Pro Stitcher, we have used our drag and drop, we have changed our bobbin, everything is in place, and so now, simply up on the screen, we simply hit our resume. We always double check that our needle is up. I never use the needle down position, but our needle is up, we are safe. I hit resume. It's going to find where it's going to start for that next row. Take a stitch, it's going to pull away. I'm going to grab my bobbin thread. I'm going to go ahead, hit resume. It's going to take a few lock stitches. It's then going to start and go about 3 inches. It's going to pause while I cut that thread. And now I simply hit resume again. And we are good to go for another row. You know, I have to say, I love the ease of this machine to go row by row. I just find it so user-friendly, and especially for myself, not being a computer literate person. I don't have to think a whole lot about it. Now, as you're doing this and you're working through your quilt, if something happens, for example, what if you hadn't checked your bobbin and you ran out of bobbin at a specific spot halfway between the quilt? All you do is stop and you go and you check out our tutorial on how to reposition for an edge to edge quickly. And then you can come back and continue with the quilt. We're down now to our last row of quilting. So now I am going to go ahead and I'm going to do a basting line right down to the bottom, and then I'm going to slowly start to baste across the bottom of my quilt before we actually quilt the last row of the edge to edge. So pull my thread up. Come down, and we want to remember my gears are engaged, but I'm still able to move fairly smoothly. I'm going to come down. Right within that binding line, about 1/8 of an inch in, come down to the bottom, hit stop, and now I'm going to take out about 4 pins at a time. Keep my dish handy. Use the last pin, just kind of pin my leader back, come down, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull it just a little bit, and I'm going to keep it nice and straight as I work my way across. Keep it nice and straight. I'm not stretching the fabric, but I'm keeping it nice and taut. Now also, as I'm pulling this down, I'm not pulling it away from my needle. I'm pulling it in towards. That way I'm not going to get any fullness or work in any tucks. Now sometimes we'll just do that. We'll pull. If it starts to get full, we'll just go this way, pull a little bit, take out another group of pins. And continue this way all the way across the bottom of the quilt. Pull that back so it's not in the way. Remove that pin and keep moving down. Again, I am putting fullness in, moving my way down. I have my stitches set at 5 stitches per inch, so I'm not getting tight stitches, so there's not going to be any tucking. Now I'm going to head up and do up the side. Now I have the side and the bottom completely basted, and now I can quilt my last row. Now before we quilt the last row, we just basted our edge, so we want to make sure to go back and add our stitches per inch to get it back up to 12. So we're at 12 stitches per inch. We are good to go there. Get out of there. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to start to quilt our row. Make sure our needle's up. All is well. Resume. There we go. Okay, so now we have finished the edge-to-edge portion of our quilt, and the next part that I'm going to do, which is the final part before I trim, because I like to give all of my quilts back trimmed to my clients, is I'm going to go around the whole edge and roll it on the way back up and baste the edge where it's gone off the edge. That way all the stitches are guaranteed to be locked, and I'll typically do that at about 12 or 13 stitches per inch. And at this point I can go into my Pro Stitcher and unlock my gears, make it a little easier. And now I can move my hand free motion, just like there wasn't a computer on there. You know, I have to say that is the one thing I absolutely love about the Handi Quilter with the Pro Stitcher, is once you remove the gears, the machine feels just like there isn't a computer on it. I have never had a machine feel that smooth once you disengage it. Go up the side, stop, needle down, and then I'm going to roll my quilt, continue up this side, cut thread, go to the other side, go back and forth until the whole quilt has been rebasted around the edge. Remove the quilt from the frame, trim, and call the client. Well, there we have it. That is one of many methods in doing a computerized edge-to-edge on the amazing Pro Stitcher. So I hope you enjoyed, and I hope your quilting experience is just as joyful as mine is, whether you're computer literate or not. So have a wonderful day, take care of each other, and we will see you down the road. And make sure to hit the subscribe button below on the YouTube channel so that way you can see many more of our free tutorials.